And for the final time this seminar series, I will introduce Dr. Hayes Goosey, our MSU Extension Forage Specialist, presenting on forage, harvest, and storage. So take it away, Hayes.
Okay, well, thank you all very much and appreciate attending. So as always with the other two seminars, here's my contact information on the screen, office number and an email. Feel free to call or email anytime and with any questions that you might have, and I will certainly get back to you. So with that, we'll go ahead and jump in. So start off with just the hay harvest here. And so kind of broke this up into different strategies of what the harvest might be. So if you're looking for a high quality harvest, certainly alfalfa at times you want to harvest as a high quality crop, and that would be where it has high nutrient concentrations, high digestibility, high intake potential, and then high efficiency of utilization. So a crop that typically may go for a different class of animal, like a dairy or things along those, or forage that could be used for flushing ewes at certain times. So kind of the guidelines you can look up on the table 8.3 up in the top center. It breaks out the supreme, premium, good, fair, and the utility, and then it gives the different parameters. The ADF generally represents the digestibility. NDF generally represents intake. And you've got a relative feed value and total digestible nutrients and crude protein. You can see going from supreme to utility, all of these metrics get worse. In other words, in worse in the sense that you're accumulating more fibers, your relative feed value is decreasing, your total digestible nutrients are decreasing, and so is your crude protein. But again, cow-calf operations, ewe-lamb operations don't need supreme quality forages, and so that's kind of what we'll break this stuff out as we get going. Typical down at the bottom, typical protein concentrations of typical hays for beef cow, and these would work just fine for ewe-lamb operations too. And so mid-bloom alfalfa, about 16% crude protein, mid-maturity grass or hays about 10.5, and late maturity grass hays about 8. You can see the total digestible nutrients. And then this is just a parameter of generally about the feed that's wasted in association with those. And so you can see those differ substantially than the supreme or premium quality hays. But if you're most people are raising hay for the purpose of feeding to their own livestock. But if you are in the business of growing hay for sale and targeting a particular class of animal, then those things are certainly of interest to you. So let's get into the harvest. Keep working on the harvest losses in association with the qualities. So if we look at just the dry matter loss, obviously, as we go to the right on here, most people are stacking dry hay. Every time we've got a little bit of high moisture hay. But for the most part, everybody around the majority of people are stacking a dry hay. And of course, that's where we have the highest harvest losses. And that's because the plants are dry and they lose a substantial amount or can lose a substantial amount of the dry matter, which is typically the leaves. And the stalks remain, and that's what decreases the quality of that. So you're going to lose hay during a harvest, but we can go about things to try to lose as little as possible that we can. And the reason that most people are harvesting the dry hay is that it's just, one, if you're selling it, it's more marketable because it's easy to transport, but two, if you're feeding it back on your same operation, it's just a lot easier to deal with and serves the purpose of what it is you need. So harvest timing, again, as I've done in all these seminars, there's a lot more language on the screen than I'm necessarily going to talk about. Something I can send the presentation out to people if they like it, but wanted to keep as much text as possible so that way people could read it on their own and it would be meaningful rather than just a few bullet points that really only made sense to me. So, and by all means ask questions as we're going through. There'll be a couple points to stop as we go. Plant maturity then is the single most important factor for affecting that forage quality. You can see in our figure over here, when we start off in the vegetative stage, if we look at the dry matter digestibility, you're looking at, there's only about, between the total yield and the stem yield, only about a 10% difference or so. or it's 10% difference, but the total digestibility is only doubled compared to that's because there's so many leaves at the vegetative stage. When we get up here to that first flower, we see about the same relationship, and now 80% we've jumped up with that stem yield. So as the crops mature, you're generally putting on more stem material, and that's increasing yield, but it's also decreasing quality and decreasing digestibility of that. So back to the idea of harvesting for the highest quality hay requires frequent cuttings at a younger growth stage, and harvesting for more just maintenance feed, utility feeds, we're harvesting closer into that first flower. 10% flower is generally what we recommend on that, 10% being 1 to 10 blooms. So for every 10 stems in the field, one of them is blooming. So on a timing, again, it's going to base on kind of what we talked about. Decide whether you're after yield or quality is your goal. And you can base that net kit income from realistic yields and prices from the various grades. And those are listed online. Just thinking about it, probably could have put a link to that. But the USDA has market reports, and certain web pages have USDA-based market reports about the prices of forage. And then again, consider the livestock needs. So on top, we've got a dairy versus down bottom, we've got a cow-calf operation in the middle of winter. And so typically the cow-calf, the ewe-lamb operation requires or wants more mature forage. They're not after that higher quality, the super high quality forage, whereas the dairies are. And so as you're harvesting, depending on the acreage that you've got, you can stack your hay and harvest lots and try to separate them by quality. And then those different lots can be fed or marketed to a different class of livestock. So if you have fields that you know you harvested at a more immature stage, the quality of that is going to go up, and you can target a particular herd or animals on your place that may require a little higher forage quality. You can even look at feeding that maybe more during the coldest parts of the winter too, to have a little extra energy, a little more digestibility, a little extra energy in the colder parts of the winter. So talk a little bit about cool versus hot season harvests. Typically forage cutting during the spring, the day lengths are shorter. So spring being depends on when you may get your first cut in, most likely sometime in the middle towards the end of June, maybe the first week of July, depending on the elevation that you're at. But it's certainly earlier in the spring, the day length is shorter for some of it. And those temperatures may be lower in that early to midsummer time period before you get into the real hot parts of July and August. And so that crop is growing more slowly. And so they're based on just the physiology of the crop, it has a higher quality. And if folks out there have ever noticed, then a lot of times, or a good chunk of the time, cattle prefer that first cut. And that's typically because it's a little higher quality. In the late spring, so just an example of that, acid detergent fiber, ADF, in alfalfa can increase 1% in 3 days, but it'll typically take, midsummer only takes 2 to 2.5 days. So you're increasing that or decreasing the digestibility, decreasing the intake factors as you mature into that summertime. So times a year to harvest, typically Montana dryland, you're getting 1 cutting. Irrigated, you're getting 2, and then you're doing a stockpile for the fall for some forage grazing. But for those, when you are swathing, you try to capture as much of the TNC, which is total non-structural carbohydrates, which is the starches, sucrose, glucose, and fructose, the sugars in the plant themselves. And so take a look at the chart on the right there, and you'll see that these non-structural carbohydrates, as they're increasing, they typically peak about sundown because that plant is photosynthesizing all day. And then they decrease at night because the plant is utilizing some of those carbohydrates during non-photosynthesis hours. And then come sun up again, you'll start to increase. So kind of a general rule that we look at is try to, and if you have, sometimes you've got acreage that doesn't allow you to do this. And sometimes you're just trying to get that hay down. And so it doesn't always fit. But if you have the option, try to focus your cutting around 6 p.m. That's or about when that sundown is, which changes a little bit, maybe a little later in the summer months. And basically what that does is it allows you to capture that most of the non-structural carbohydrates in that forage, because that's when they're there and they're present. So if you send that cut on 6 p.m., it's kind of a good time. If you had a 12-hour harvest, you'd begin cutting about noon and continue till midnight. And that would capture the most non-structural carbohydrates. A harvesting sampling scheme like that would do the best. Like I say, it's not always possible, but keep those kind of things in mind as you're doing that. And you might as well, when the carbohydrates are there, you might as well try to harvest as many of them as you can. If you do cut in the morning, try to cut the most mature fields. And that's just a quality issue as well. They're not going to be, the structural carbohydrates are not going to be produced in the more mature alfalfas. So cut those first. But again, it kind of fits in with the program that you've got, and it just some things to think about as you're going through that. One of the things too to look at is that when you cut the forage, you're going to be about 50 to 80% moisture in the crop. And then when you're baling, typically here's some general guidelines for the smaller bales, less than 20%, for about 130 pounders, 180%. Then for your large, mid-sized to large bales, the round bales, about 16%. And so how do you know? And the closer you can get to that without being above that, the less leaf loss you'll have, because as forages continue to dry down is where you see that higher levels of leaf loss. So one thing you can do, there's a video down here at the bottom if you were interested in really calculating the moisture of the swath rows or the windrows. If you've raked it, then you can do that to try to get as close to those percentages as possible. There's two types of moisture to pay attention to, and there's the stem moisture and then the humidity in the dew, and each one has a different rate of loss from the plants, and you can actually use the dew moisture as a way to retain leaf retention on the plants when you're baling. And so that's something to pay attention to. So a lot of times early morning baling can be better depending on where all that moistures are at. But typically you don't capture enough moisture in that baling from the dew process to really damage any of the hay. Obvious weather considerations. I mean, what can you do about that? Nothing that you can really do about the weather, but you can try to schedule harvest to avoid bad weather if possible. And again, that's where I've talked a little bit about in some of the other presentations, having alfalfas that mature at different times. So you can spread those harvests out, and so that can actually give you a bit of a buffer. And then obviously take advantage of the good weather in those. But the most important factor affecting hay dry down, the tearing, is that solar radiation, the air temperatures, the relative humidities, and wind speed, and then the soil moisture. So soil moisture is important because it can keep hay wet from the bottom. So a lot of times people will irrigate real heavily before they swath, and the idea being to saturate that soil. So after swathing, there's adequate soil moisture for the second cutting to grow. That can actually prolong baling just by having so much moisture in the soils. You can actually increase soil compaction as you're driving in the fields too. But so something to think about if you do that, and you're noticing that your hay doesn't dry down as fast as maybe the neighbors, that may be a reason why that's happening. Then obviously the relative humidity, but again, there's nothing you can really do about that. But the hotter it is or the drier it is, the relative humidity, the quicker obviously that these forages are going to cure and dry up. You can increase the swath rows to dry down a little quicker in some considerations. But again, if you've got your swather purchased, it's a 48-inch swath row maintenance, and that's where you're at. But once that forage is below 15%, that's where I was talking about. You can really use that the morning dew to retain leaves on the stems, as long as you get down that fine. Consider crimping or conditioning can reduce that curing time too. And the idea obviously is to get the hay down, get it dried quick, and get it in the bales before it gets rained on. So some things you can do, there's but keep in mind, these are just some options. If you're in parts of the state, where you're higher elevation, or you're maybe the northwest part of the state where you're getting more precipitation, there's machine or equipment called tedders, pictured here on the right. They shorten down that dry time about a half a day. Essentially, you run this over the field right after harvest, and what that does is it takes those swath rows and spreads them out, and then you come back in and rake that forage back in before you bale. Again, you want to do it right afterward. It's another trip over the field, so it's extra time and it's extra gas. And if you're not experiencing any dry down issues, then the fewer amounts of equipment you have to own and maintain, and fewer times you have to drive over the field, the more that hay is, the less of your input it costs in those hay. So, but keep in mind that the leaf loss then is what causes that typical highest yield losses and quality losses to any harvested forage that you'll have. What most people do, is some particular type of a rake. Wheel rakes are real common, and what they're just to gather that forage in a windrow, or move an existing windrows. You can have like a V-shaped rake here, and a lot of times you can grab two windrows, swath rows, and roll them into one, so there's less driving associated with baling. But you typically want to rake when the moisture is 35 to 40%, and again, that can come in with that microwave method of determining the forage moisture content. Above 40% can increase the drying time, because when you have it does what's called roping, or if you rake too soon, it actually can increase the density of that swath row, and it's called roping, and so it decreases or increases the drying time. So don't want to rake too early if you can. In terms of, we talked earlier, I think it was last seminar about alfalfa weevil management, and so there is the option if you have high alfalfa weevil damage in that first crop and you're concerned about green up in the second crop, and early raking is an option to manage to kill the weevil larvae in there. So be aware that can cause some of the dry down issues when you do that, but it's a very good method of preventing second cut damage from the alfalfa weevils and the larvae. The wheel rakes, you want to try to adjust the speed on those to minimize leaf shatter, and try to minimize, like I say, that roping or that tightening of the hay by going slow, so you get more of a fluff rather than an actual tightening of that. There's an article just in a popular press magazine on different types of rakes if folks want to take a look at that. And probably the easiest way, even if you're doing an early rake, is to you'll have to go slower with that, just to try not to condense those rows too much. There are equipments, mergers, essentially an inverter. Essentially what you do is you drive down the row. You can shoot it off to either side, but the hay comes up into here, and then this belt is moving one way or the other. It essentially takes the forage, the hay, the row, swath row, and whatever side was touching the ground, it actually flips that over when it dumps it out the other side and inverts it, so that you get a quicker dry down by taking the more moisture, higher moisture forage that's closer to the soil and flipping that up. So there's something to do. Again, these are options in places where you're getting high moisture that don't fit into a lot of the production areas in Montana, just based on the precipitation patterns. Always have the options of using conditioners, and those essentially they crush or they crack the new forage, and that just allows places for the moisture to evaporate out, and so it decreases the drying time, and it has a more even dry to it as well. There's different kinds of ones that are out there. Typically, you go with what came with the swather, but make sure that sometimes those aren't set So you can take a look at those and make sure that those are set appropriately, that you've got them, that they're functioning. Again, you can go to a 60-inch windrow if possible. And then again, that just spreads that forage out a little wider so that your drying time is decreased. Another thing to pay attention to is the baler. Depends on what you've got, but you can use with the right baler, you can use a baler monitor that tells you the pressure reading in that bale chamber. And where this helps is that as the pressure goes up, the hay is getting drier. And as the pressure goes down, the hay is getting wetter. So if you're in the market, if you don't have one that has that hookup and you're in the market to get one and you're concerned about baling too wet a forage, that's something you can get. They typically recommend operating between 1200 and 1600 PSI, but some of the new ones out there may have different recommendations. But what that does is it allows you to realize if you're getting into an area where forage is really too wet. You can spray paint those, mark those bales, and then stack them independently and feed them as quickly as possible. We'll talk about the heat in forage in the bales from too high a moisture here in just a few slides, but keep that in mind. No, actually, it's on this slide right here. So, but look at, when you stack or when you harvest and bale at too high of a moisture content, there's the breakdown process, the microbes in there give off a substantial amount of heat. And so you can see how much heat is given off just at the different bale moisture percentages. And that's associated with, if we look at on the bottom chart here, NDF. So increase in NDF, which is what we don't want. If we harvested the forage by having heating units up to 6, maybe 900, which on the top chart puts us up, maybe around baling around the high 20s, maybe around 30% moisture, will increase that NDF or decrease the intake potential of that forage increase that upwards of around 8.5%. So something to think about as you're baling. Make sure that forage is dried down before, and make sure that you're getting that forage put up at the right moisture content. So just some kind of general harvest recommendations. Quality decreases as the plant matures, and so you schedule your harvest to try and cut at that desired maturity. And again, we call it 1 to 10 bloom, which is about 10% bloom, 1 out of every 10 stems in the field. If you randomly go and sample some of those or look at some of those, should have a bloom. And that's about the point where you're maximizing yield and quality, the crude proteins, and minimizing NDFs and ADFs. So that typically works pretty good for most cow-calf, ewe-lamb operations as a general rule to cut. So consider the day cycling, as we talked about. Try to stratify around 6 p.m., something in there, if you have the chance to do that. Take advantage of good weather, obviously, and to speed the drying. You can monitor the forage content if you want, and try to perform harvest and baling at those best times. A higher stubble height allows faster drying because it allows aeration, but that also reduces yield. These are things just to think about if you're experiencing problems, some things you can do to try to remedy that. And here's the 48 versus the 60-inch swath rows. Make sure that your swathers are in good repair. Their settings are adjusted. The conditioners are working good. You can condition the crop during swathing to increase that water, and it's always a good idea. Rake roll or TED the windrows increases that air movement. And then always, especially with the annual forages, you want to test those for nitrates, and that your county agents have the ability to do that, or we can get a hold and we can get some of those things done. But so at that point, I'll throw it out for any questions if there's any going yet. See any?
I do not see any in the chat yet. Nope.
Okay, fair enough. We'll just keep going, and we'll have another question session here in just a little bit. So one thing to think about during the harvest is blister beetles. And so what blister beetles do. People associate them more with horses, but they're toxic to cattle and sheep as well. The horses appear to be more susceptible, but that's, I think, mainly because when a horse dies, typically there's a veterinarian that there may be some type of analysis of look of why that animal died, and they can determine it was blister beetles. Where if you or a cow dies, there's typically not any kind of a necropsy done on the process. So I know there are cases out there of that happening, but something to pay attention to. There's the active ingredient, which is cantharidin. There's 9 species of blister beetle in Montana. You can see I have them listed here and the general days that they're out. Now, none of these 9 have ever been attributed to livestock loss. The cantharidin levels in these beetles is so low that they have to eat hundreds and hundreds of the beetles in order for it to deliver a toxic level. The striped blister beetle, which is pictured here at the bottom, has very exceptionally high levels of cantharidin. And it's the one that's been documented numerous times for livestock horse poisonings. But to date, we haven't found it in Montana. But to my knowledge, there hasn't really been anyone looking for it. For the last time there was a survey was maybe 15 years ago. And so we do know that it's found in eastern Wyoming, South Dakota, and North Dakota. And so if it's here, it could very well be in the southern parts or southeastern part of the state, those parts of the state that would be bordering Wyoming, South Dakota, maybe some of the southern parts of North Dakota. And so one of the things that makes the blister beetle, so if you do see some, we'd like to know, and it's maybe something that could be done would be to go and do some more surveys to see if that's here. I had some questions about that earlier, that they were concerned about some blister beetle poisonings in forages, and we determined it wasn't the blister beetle, but still there may be some issues in some of those areas. So the problem with how the blister beetles end up in the forages is they're really not a pest of alfalfa. They do eat a little bit, but not much. But what they do is they aggregate in alfalfa fields for breeding. And so, and the striped blister beetle not only has very high levels of the toxin, but it has very, very dense aggregations. And so when you're swathing, you pick those up, and then as they go through the conditioner, I just got done telling you to use a conditioner. And now if you know you have high blister beetles, you don't want to use that conditioner because it kills, as it runs that alfalfa through the conditioners, it kills the beetles. And so then you come and you bale that up. And since they aggregate in very tight bunches in the field, when you feed that particular bale, there'll be an animal, as you think if you roll out that round bale, you're rolling that out, and a certain section of that will have a very high number of blister beetles in it. And then that animal that gets to that, to the hay at that particular spot then has the chance to consume a lot more of the beetles. And that's how you get that build up to those toxic levels. So again, we haven't ever documented it here in Montana. Be maybe good to revisit that. But if you are in areas or you purchase hay from areas where there is striped blister beetles, that's something to be aware of too, that could happen. You're transporting those in with the state. So let's move on to a little bit of the storage. So you want to be around that 16%, but you're still going to lose about 3.5% dry matter, the mass, in about 4 months. And that's just from fungal and microbial activity. Losses are greater, up to 10% in hay that's baled at higher moisture levels. And that higher moisture just provides a very good environment for mold and other microbial activity. So yield losses generally as low as 3% for bales stored in a barn or a hay shed, and as high as 15% for bales outside on the soil or sod over the winter. So keep that in mind. That's mainly just from the oxygen and the moisture contents. Of Quality losses, so that was the yield losses, 3 to 15%. And then on those bales left outside uncovered, you can get as high as a 14% reduction in quality. And that's the crude proteins. As those decrease, the NDF relative proportions of the fibers go up. Well, let's go back to the chart. Just basically talks about the expected damage at a particular bale moisture level. You can see you want to keep that in that, 15 less than 15% area. You're going to experience some kind of physical weathering, that's for sure. Bales stored outside on the soil without covers have that most damage, most weathering loss. A stat I came across is a 1-inch rain can add about 20 gallons of water to a 4-foot by 8-foot bale, so one of the big squares. Hard core density bales, so the tighter you pack them, the better they shed the water. The net wrap on the round bales is better than twine. It helps the moisture to wick off the sides of that, and then storing them up on some type of a pad or a basically piled rock or somewhere where they're not right directly in contact with the dirt is the best. For bales that do get wet, you wouldn't think that the top 3 inches or top 4 inches of that bale would be all that much, but 3 inches of damage around the circumference of that bale impacts about 17% of the bale. 4 inches impacts about 22% of the bale. And that's just because of the circumference and the amount of forage that's contained in those outside wraps. So just some microbial growth patterns here. Again, just an effort on the right, and this probably most people have pretty well know this pretty much anyway, but just kind of drive it home. Somewhere in a barn is the 100%, so they compared everything against that. And then here's just some different parameters that they looked at, and the dry matter percent remaining after that. You can see ground, on the ground, no cover is the worst. The pyramid stack plus a plastic cover, and so as they go up to the top. But the bacteria and the molds and other microbes, they use those non-structural carbohydrates, the things you're trying to harvest for the animal. They utilize those and they produce carbon dioxide, water, and then heat. And depending on the moisture, they can produce a lot of heat, cause enough to actually have bales spontaneously combust. That causes that increase in the fibers, the ADF and NDF, and decreases that crude protein. You can also have what's called caramelization in there, and it's a production of, it gives it almost a tobacco type of odor. The cows love to eat it, but during that heating process, it's made a lot of the nutrients immobile, so they can't utilize them when they eat them. So even though they run right to it, it's not a digestible feed that they can get the energy and the nutrients out of it that they need. As I said about the fires, chemical, above 160, chemical reactions can lead to spontaneous combustions. So be aware of moisture, and that's a direct result of the moisture content in the bale. So kind of some more general guidelines, for where to keep those and during the storage process. And then some recommendations for handling heating hay. And this is mostly going to happen, obviously, in the summer times. This won't be, if you get bales that get, pretty waterlogged in December, we're not too worried about a spontaneous combustion. And so these are hotter times of the years and things to worry about. Places to store them, obviously, hay sheds are good, hay barns or hay sheds. They're permanent structures. The hay sheds typically have 1 to 3 sides, just kind of a technical difference, whereas the hay barns are totally enclosed. They are really effective about minimizing losses to about 5%. They reduce losses from the shed storage, and even justify their construction within a few years, depending again on that quality of hay that you're after and how much hay you're putting up, how much you're selling, how much you're feeding, and how much you may have to buy to supplement some losses due to weathering. You can justify building something of that structure like that. They can also serve as machinery storage, all-purpose storage after as the bales are used up. So they have dual purpose. but it's something to pay attention to in terms of the quality that you can get out of that. Some haystack recommendations. Uncovered pyramid types have the most damage, and that's just from water continually trickles down these haystacks and water logs into those, and then they're sitting on the ground itself, the majority, and so you get damage on that bottom rows from both the soil moisture and the top. And so if you can avoid that, or at least get those up on something to have them aerated underneath, is good. The mushroom can be kind of the middle, and the ones that is recommended the most, it takes up the most space, but it keeps the hay the driest, is to have several feet in between them, and then in between the ends of the bales you've got 6 to 12 inches, and then stacked up on something to keep them up and off the ground. You can, like it says, you can allow 3 feet or so between the stacked rows. Separate the stacks, of 100 tons. You can separate those by 50 feet in case there was a fire in one of those. Should be well drained, like say rock pads or anything like that. And then ask about insurance. That's a fair amount of forages there, and so that may be something criteria on an insurance premium or coverage that you may want to look into. And then the mesh coverings on the round bales reduces that weathering effects and stabilizes hay better than the twine, but it costs more. But it should, a lot of those times, those things pay for themselves just in the retention of the nutrients. Tarps are another option you can do. You can consider some of these following recommendations, some tips. So install those tarps as soon as possible after that stacking when you get that hay put up, just to keep it from getting rained on. Try to form a peak up at the top. You can kind of see it here, but they've got a little bit of a peak. So it's like the eaves of a house. So when it does rain or snow, that water runs off rather than pooling up on top. Try to have a couple of people. Sometimes shorter tarps are better than 2 shorter tarps are better than 1 longer one. I found it best to have 3 people. That doesn't always happen that way, but have 1 person up on top and 1 on each side. Pull the tarp straps tight. I found a stat about 150 to 300 pounds. And that may be something to look at, but mainly get them tight because of the wind, and you want that hay protected. So secure those up about every 4 feet at a maximum of about every 4 feet. Stacks shrink over time. Just as I mentioned, there's about even in good condition, there's about 4% dry matter loss, and so that you'll have to tighten those tarps up. Depending on when you're going to feed them, you may have to tighten those up. And then obviously as the hay's removed and you're feeding that, pull those tarps back over and cover that portion up and try to tie it securely. Depends on how many times you're in and out. You can depend on that. I understand it's a hassle to do that every day if you're feeding out of the same stack. But if you're grabbing stack, you can move some out to another spot and feed from there. But just something to keep in mind. And then the tarps, they cost quite a bit of money. They're worth it. But you can get those, put them away, try to keep the rodents out of them. You'll have them for quite a few years to come with that. People have done some of this plastic wrap high moisture bales. I don't think it's too common here in Montana. I've seen a little bit of it. But so a study in Wisconsin, they wrapped 1,000-pound rectangular bales, and that adequately preserved them at 21 to 38% moisture. So what happens in there is that plastic wrap seals them, and you get microbial activity for a while, but finally they run out of oxygen, and so it produces that anaerobic environment. So it stops the microbial growths in there. They reported that there was some browning. I haven't really had much experience with these, but the forage quality was unaffected. They said with plastic thickness above 4 millimeters. So apparently below that, it wasn't thick enough. And so there was bale damage, but above that, it wasn't. But they recommended 8 mil as to reduce the tearing. And once that bag is torn open, then oxygen gets back in, and it can start that, and water can get in and start, or the water is already there, but it can start that decomposition process. Try to get the bales, don't wrap the bales for more than 24 hours after that baling. Brown bales can also be successfully wrapped. You can do them in these big tubes like they're down here on the bottom. or you can do them individually like you see up here on top. It's more expensive, and it could be risky. Some advantages: you get a higher feed value, 3% mass loss compared to 50 to 20% with the larger dry bales, or 5 to 20% with the larger dry bales. And again, that's just because you're baling it and putting it up when it's wetter, so you don't have all that leaf loss. You typically bale it a day or two sooner. Disadvantages: obviously it weighs a lot more because it has a lot more moisture in it. So the hauling distances and the costs due to weight are way up. If that plastic tears, it allows oxygen in and it spoils that bale. So if you are doing this or considering it and you know you've torn a bale, the plastic wrap, be sure to feed that one as quickly as possible. The cost is higher than dry hay, and there may be a different equipment need, as you can see down here on the bottom. You may need to purchase different types of loaders to get that job accomplished. So one more piece of equipment to maintain and pay for. So you have to do the math on that and see if what you're getting out of it in forage quality is paying for the extra equipment and time that you may have to put into that. Some kind of general storage and preservation guidelines that I put in here for people to take a look at. Storage is always going to result in dry matter loss, lowered forage quality, and reduced feed intake and utilization. No matter how you store it, you still have some issues associated with that. Even silage, the quality may go up, but you lose a lot of bulk in that process. So there's always a trade-off, and you'll lose something. The more valuable the hay is, the easier it's to justify spending more time and more money to improve the storage conditions. So that's just something that you have to look at in your operation and determine if building extra structures is worth the quality increase and yield increase you're going to have throughout the feeding season. So most people in Montana need to be 1 to 4 months of stored forages. So that's something that you can pencil out. As hay density increases, the bale density I should have put in there. So tightly packed bales, you have less storage loss, outside storage loss, than you would with a loosely packed, just because they shed water that much better. Dry hay, the most people are putting up dry hay is because it's the most versatile feed for the cost. And that's why we still recommend that for most operations in the state, that's the best way to go with that. High moisture hay storage requires better management, requires better time. And a lot of times you're busy with certain times of the year and you just don't have time for that. There's a reason that most people are stacking dry hay and that it fits the operations the best. But there's options out there if you're looking at something else on that. So that's what I have for this evening. Again, as always, here's the Animal and Range, my Extension Forages webpage with lots of good information on there. And with that, I'll turn it back over.
Okay, I don't see any questions yet. But if any of you have any, feel free to type them in the chat or unmute. While we give that a couple minutes, we're done with haze, unfortunately, but we are not done with the webinar series. Next week, we have Dr. Megan Van Emmen talking about forage quality for livestock, how it'll affect your feeding decisions. And then finally, I think the one that a lot of people are looking forward to, hay valuation. How do you decide what to sell your hay for, or if you're getting ripped off when you're buying it? So make sure to tune in for those as well. And I'm still not seeing any questions here. So thank you, Hayes. Thank you for joining us, everyone here.
You bet. Thank you, opportunity, and